I'm Marcus, 42 years old, and everything changed when a flight attendant tapped my shoulder and said, "Maintenance is down that way," because of my skin color. I smiled, sat in first class, and watched her face as the pilot came out, saluted me, and said, "Welcome back, Captain." But to understand how that moment felt, you need to know about the 30 years of quiet battles that led me there. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how a lifetime of proving myself led to one perfect moment of vindication. Growing up in Millfield, Ohio meant being one of 3 black families in a town of 8,000 people. My father, James, had served 2 tours in Vietnam before settling into civilian life as a maintenance supervisor at the local manufacturing. My mother, Dorothy, worked the early shift at the hospital cafeteria so she could be home when I got off the school bus. They never talked about the military much, but Dad kept his dress uniform pressed and hanging in the back of their closet, along with a box of medals he never displayed. Our house was small but immaculate, with Mom's flower garden in front and Dad's vegetable patch in back. Every surface gleamed because Mom believed that people were always watching, always looking for reasons to judge us differently. "You have to be twice as good to get half as much," she'd say while helping me with homework at the kitchen table. "That's not fair, baby, but that's how it is." Dad would nod from his recliner, not looking up from his newspaper, but I knew he was listening. School meant navigating a careful balance between excelling and not standing out too much. My teachers praised my work with a tone of surprise that even at age 7 I could detect. "Marcus is so articulate," they'd tell my parents during conferences, as if this was unexpected rather than the result of my mother reading to me every night since I was old enough to sit still. My classmates were mostly kind, but there were moments. The time Tommy Patterson asked if I was adopted because I didn't look like my parents, or when Mrs. Henderson assigned me to write about my culture while the other kids got to pick any topic they wanted. The dream of flying began during the summer I turned 8, when the county fair hosted an air show. Dad drove us there in our aging Buick, parking in the dusty field alongside hundreds of other families. The moment those planes took off, something inside me shifted. The precision, the power, the way they moved through the sky like they were dancing. I knew I wanted to be up there. When the pilots landed and took off their helmets, walking around to talk with the crowd, I noticed they were all white men, but somehow that didn't diminish the pull I felt toward aviation. Dad noticed my fascination and surprised me the next weekend by driving to the small regional airport 20 minutes away. We sat in his truck at the edge of the chain-link fence, watching Cessnas take off and land while he told me about the helicopters he'd worked on in the Army. "Flying's a good skill," he said quietly. "Clean work, respectable." He didn't say what we both understood, that it was also expensive and that people who looked like me rarely got opportunities to pursue dreams that costly. Money was always tight in our household, though my parents worked hard to hide their stress from me. Dad picked up weekend shifts whenever possible, and Mom took on extra catering jobs during the holidays. Our family vacations consisted of day trips to the lake or visits to my grandmother's house 2 towns over. When I started talking about wanting to learn to fly, my parents exchanged the kind of look that passed between them when I asked for things beyond our reach. But instead of dismissing the idea, they started researching. By age 10, I knew that flight lessons cost $60 an hour, that a private pilot's license required 40 hours minimum, and that commercial aviation demanded thousands more hours of training and certification. I also knew that Dad's salary barely covered our mortgage, and Mom's income went toward groceries and my school clothes. The math was depressing, but my parents approached it like a military operation, gathering information and developing a long-term strategy. "If this is what you really want," Dad told me on my 11th birthday, "you'll need to work for it harder than any of your classmates will have to work for anything." He'd researched youth programs at the airport, jobs I could do around the house for money, and the academic requirements for aviation programs at state universities. The path he outlined would take years of saving every penny and maintaining perfect grades while other kids played video games and went to movies. That night, lying in my narrow bed under a ceiling plastered with model airplanes I'd built from kits bought with allowance money, I made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. I was going to become a pilot no matter how long it took or how many people doubted I belonged in that cockpit. I had no idea then how many times I would be redirected toward more realistic goals, or how exhausting it would become to smile politely while proving my competence over and over again. The first person to tell me I should be realistic about my aviation dreams was Mrs. Patterson, my high school guidance counselor, during our mandatory career planning meeting in my junior year. I'd maintained a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at the grocery store, saving every dollar for flight lessons I still couldn't afford. When I explained my goal of becoming a commercial airline pilot, she set down her pen and gave me the look I'd grown accustomed to, part pity, part condescension. "Marcus, you're a bright young man," she said, shuffling through college brochures on her desk. But aviation is extremely competitive and expensive. Have you considered more practical options? The community college has an excellent automotive program, and with your mechanical aptitude, she slid a pamphlet across the desk featuring smiling students working on car engines. I took it politely, knowing I'd throw it away the moment I left her office, and asked about the requirements for 4-year aviation programs anyway. By senior year, I'd managed to accumulate enough money for 3 flight lessons by working every weekend and holiday at Peterson's Market, stocking shelves and bagging groceries while my classmates went to parties and football games. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a Cessna 152 at Millfield Regional Airport, my hands were shaking so badly that the instructor, a weathered man named Chuck Williams, asked if I was nervous about flying. I wasn't nervous about flying. I was terrified that I wouldn't be good at it, that this dream I'd nursed for 9 years would crumble the moment I actually tried to control an aircraft. Chuck was patient and thorough, explaining each instrument and control with the kind of detail that suggested he understood how much this lesson meant to me. When we taxied to the runway for my first takeoff, the engine noise was deafening, but somehow exactly what I'd imagined during all those nights staring at my ceiling full of model planes. The moment we lifted off the ground, everything clicked into place with a certainty that surprised me. This wasn't just something I wanted to do, this was something I was meant to do. After landing, Chuck surprised me by saying I had natural instincts and good hands for flying. "You planning to pursue this seriously?" he asked as we walked back to the flight school office. When I explained my financial situation and long-term goals, he offered something I hadn't expected: the chance to work around the airport in exchange for reduced lesson rates. Cleaning planes, fueling aircraft, helping with maintenance in exchange for flight time. It wasn't charity, he assured me. They genuinely needed the help, but it was the first break I'd gotten in years of planning. The arrangement meant spending every free hour at the airport, arriving before school to help with morning prep, and staying until dark on weekends. My parents worried about my grades suffering, but somehow the physical work and time around aircraft improved my focus in the classroom. I was tired constantly, but it was the good kind of tired that comes from moving towards something you want desperately. My classmates started asking fewer questions about how I spent my time, which was fine with me. I'd never been particularly social anyway. My first solo flight came 3 months before my 18th birthday, on a cold Tuesday afternoon when the wind was calm and Chuck decided I was ready. The moment he climbed out of the plane and told me to take it around the pattern alone, my heart rate spiked so high I could hear it in my ears. But once I was airborne, flying that circuit by myself, something fundamental shifted. I wasn't just dreaming of piloting, I was actually piloting an aircraft alone, making decisions and executing maneuvers I'd practiced dozens of instructors. When I landed and taxied back to the ramp, Chuck was grinning wider than I'd ever seen. "How'd it feel?" he asked, and I couldn't find words adequate to describe the combination of accomplishment and hunger it had triggered. I wanted to go up again to build our experience. The path was, but it was also revealing itself expensive. College applications that fall were an exercise in managed expectation. The aviation programs at major universities required not just excellent grades, but also significant fine for flight training that weren't covered by standard financial aid packages. Ohio State's program looked perfect, but would cost nearly $60,000 over 4 years. Embry-Riddle was the gold standard, but might as well have been on the moon financially. I applied to both anyway, along with several backup options, but deep down I knew where I'd probably end up. The acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived on a Saturday in March, thick and official looking. My parents gathered around the kitchen table as I opened it, their faces showing cautious optimism. I'd been accepted to the university, but the aviation program required a separate application and interview process, plus demonstration of financial capability to complete the flight training requirements. The letter included a worksheet estimating total costs that made my mother inhale sharply when she saw the numbers. That night, I overheard my parents discussing options in their bedroom, their voices low but not quite quiet enough. Dad was talking about taking a second mortgage on the house, and Mom was worried about the risk if I didn't finish the program or couldn't find work afterward. "He's worked so hard," she whispered, "but what if we can't afford to let him chase this dream?" I went to sleep that night with a familiar knot in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had since childhood, when I wanted something that seemed just beyond our family's reach. The rejection letter from Ohio State's aviation program arrived 6 weeks later, citing limited spaces and extremely competitive applicant pool. The backup letter suggested I consider starting at a community college to build flight hours and reapply as a transfer student. It wasn't the crushing blow I'd expected. By then, I'd already started researching Community College of Southern Ohio's aviation program and their partnerships with regional flight schools. It would take longer and require more creativity, but there was still a path forward if I was willing to take it. The Community College of Southern Ohio's aviation program operated out of a cluster of aging buildings at Burke Lakefront Airport, 45 minutes from home when traffic was light. The facilities looked nothing like the glossy brochures from four-year universities, but they had aircraft, certified instructors, and a program that would cost a third of what Ohio State wanted. My parents drove me there for orientation in August, both of them trying to project optimism while clearly worried about me living away from home for the first time. My dorm room was in a converted apartment complex that housed mostly older students returning to education after military service or career changes. My roommate Kevin was a 26-year-old former Army mechanic who'd decided to pursue aviation after his discharge. He took one look at me unpacking my single suitcase and asked if I was sure I was in the right place. "You look about 15, he said, not unkindly, but it was my first indication that fitting in here might be challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The program itself was intensive and practical, focused on building flight hours and earning certifications rather than theoretical coursework. Our class of 22 students included me, 3 women, and 18 white men ranging in age from 18 to 45. I was the only black student, which shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow still did. During our first group meeting, the chief flight instructor, Captain Morrison, outlined the requirements and timeline with military precision that reminded me of my father. Flying lessons resumed immediately, but now with the pressure of grades and program progression tied to my performance. The aircraft were older than what I'd trained on in Millfield, and the instructors rotated frequently, meaning I had to adjust to different teaching styles and personalities every few weeks. Some were encouraging and focused on improvement, while others seemed to approach instruction as an endurance test designed to weed out students who couldn't handle pressure. My first instructor, Mr. Henderson, had a habit of making comments that felt like challenges rather than guidance. "Let's see if you can handle crosswind landings better than you handled that taxi maneuver," he'd say, or "I hope you're more focused today than you were during ground school yesterday." I couldn't tell if this was his standard approach or if something about me specifically triggered his critical tone, but I absorbed his feedback without complaint and practiced until every maneuver met his standard. Ground school meant memorizing federal aviation regulations, weather patterns, navigation procedures, and aircraft systems, while maintaining grades high enough to stay in the program. I studied in the common area of our apartment building every night, surrounded by textbooks and flight charts while Kevin played video games or talked on the phone with his girlfriend back home. The material wasn't difficult, but the volume was overwhelming, especially combined with flight training schedules that changed weekly based on weather and aircraft availability. Money remained a constant source of stress. Even with financial aid and the reduced costs of community college, flight training fees accumulated faster than I'd budgeted. My parents sent what they could, usually $50 or $75 every couple weeks, but I knew those amounts represented real sacrifice at home. I found part-time work at the airport's fuel service, pumping gas for private aircraft and cleaning hangars in exchange for minimum wage and occasional opportunities to observe maintenance procedures. The other students formed study groups and social connections that seemed to develop naturally, but inclusion didn't come automatically for me. Conversations often stopped when I approached, not from obvious hostility, but from the awkward awareness that my presence changed group dynamics in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. I learned to hover at the edges of discussions until someone specifically invited me to join, which happened less frequently as the semester progressed. My first check ride, the practical exam required to advance in the program, was scheduled for November with an FAA examiner who had a reputation for thoroughness. Captain Morrison pulled me aside the week before to review my progress and preparation. "You're a competent pilot," he said, reviewing my training records. "But you'll need to be more than competent during your check ride. Examiners sometimes have different expectations for different students." The warning was subtle but clear enough. The examiner, Mr. Caldwell, was a thin man in his 60s who reviewed my logbook with particular attention to details that seemed routine when other students had been tested. He questioned my understanding of specific regulations I'd studied extensively and asked me to explain procedures I'd demonstrated successfully dozens of times. During the flight portion, he simulated emergency scenarios that went beyond the standard requirements, testing my decision-making under pressure that felt designed to find weaknesses rather than evaluate competence. When we landed and completed the debrief, Mr. Caldwell was quiet for several minutes while reviewing his notes. "You passed," he finally said, signing my temporary certificate. "But barely. Work on your confidence. Hesitation can be dangerous in aviation." I thanked him and walked back to the flight school office, knowing I'd performed well, but feeling like I'd been tested on criteria that weren't listed in any manual. That evening, Kevin found me sitting outside our building, staring at my new rating certificate in the dim light from the parking lot. "Rough check ride?" he asked, settling into the plastic chair beside me. When I described the experience, he nodded knowingly. "Caldwell gave my buddy Tom the same treatment last month," he said. "Tom's from El Salvador, been flying since he was 16. Caldwell made him repeat maneuvers 3 times before signing him off. It was the first acknowledgement from another student that the standards might not be applied equally. As my first semester ended, I'd earned my instrument rating and maintained grades that kept me eligible for financial aid. But the emotional toll was becoming apparent. Phone calls home revealed my exhaustion to my parents, who worried about my health and repeatedly asked if I was sure this path was worth the struggle. I assured them I was fine, but privately I was beginning to understand that succeeding in aviation would require not just technical competence, but also the stamina to excel while constantly proving I belonged there. The spring semester brought advanced flight training and the pressure of building hours toward commercial certification, but it also brought a growing awareness that this program was just the first obstacle in a career that would likely involve similar challenges at every level. I was learning to fly aircraft competently, but I was also learning to navigate an industry that would question my qualifications, regardless of my performance, and that lesson was proving to be just as difficult to master. The call from Skybridge Regional came on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months after I'd graduated from the community college program with my commercial pilot license and flight instructor rating. I'd sent out 47 applications to regional airlines across the Midwest and received 32 rejection letters, most citing insufficient flight time or limited opportunities. When the recruiter asked if I could be in Cleveland for an interview that Friday, I agreed immediately, despite having only 4 days to prepare and no money for interview clothes. Dad drove up from Millfield the night before my interview, bringing his only suit that he'd altered to fit my smaller frame. We stayed in a motel near the airport and over dinner at a chain restaurant. He coached me on interview techniques he'd learned during his Army career. Answer directly, maintain eye contact, and don't volunteer information they don't ask for, he advised, cutting his steak with the precision he applied to everything. They're looking for reasons to say no. Don't give them any. The interview itself went better than I'd expected. The chief pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was professional and focused on my training record and flight experience, rather than anything personal. When he offered me a position as a first officer on their EMB 120 turboprops, starting at $22,000 annually, I accepted immediately despite knowing the salary would barely cover rent and student loan payments. It was a foot in the door, the beginning of building the experience I needed for major airline consideration. Training at Skybridge took place in a converted warehouse in Akron, where 12 new hires spent 6 weeks learning aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and company policies. My classmates were mostly young white men fresh from aviation programs, plus 2 women and another minority pilot, a Hispanic man named Carlos who'd served as a helicopter pilot in the Coast Guard. The instructors were fair but demanding, and for the first time since high school, I felt evaluated purely on my performance rather than through a lens of lowered or heightened expectation. My first assigned base was Cincinnati, flying routes between small cities throughout Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The aircraft were older, the schedules demanding, and the passengers often surprised to see someone who looked like me in the cockpit. During pre-flight announcements, I could hear murmurs from the cabin. "Is that the pilot? He looks awfully young." Sometimes passengers asked the gate agent if there was a more experienced pilot available for the flight, which the gate agents handled diplomatically while I pretended not to notice. Captain Williams, my first regular flying partner, was a 20-year veteran who'd worked his way up from flight instructor to regional airline captain without ever advancing to a major carrier. He was competent and fair, but there were subtle moments when his confidence in my abilities seemed to require constant renewal. "Double-check your calculations on that fuel burn," he'd say, after I'd already verified the numbers twice, or, "Are you sure about that weather interpretation?" when I'd been studying meteorology for years. The job itself was everything I'd hoped for and more exhausting than I'd anticipated. Early morning departures meant 4 a.m. wake-up calls for 6 a.m. flights, followed by 3 or 4 legs to small airports with challenging approaches and unpredictable weather. Turnarounds were often 15 minutes, barely enough time to refuel and load new passengers before departing for the next destination. By the end of a 4-day trip, I was physically and mentally drained, but also building the flight hours I needed to advance. Living on a regional airline salary meant sharing a cramped apartment with 2 other pilots, and surviving on fast food and whatever meals I could prepare between trips. My student loans took a third of my paycheck, and after rent, utilities, and basic expenses, I had maybe $50 left each month for anything beyond survival. Phone calls home became exercises in reassuring my parents that I was fine, while carefully omitting details about my financial stress and the daily indignities that came with being questioned constantly. After 6 months on the line, I began noticing patterns in how assignments and opportunities were distributed. The better routes, those with more convenient scheduling or destinations pilots actually wanted to visit, seemed to go to certain pilots more frequently. When I asked about bidding procedures and seniority considerations, the chief pilot assured me everything was done strictly by the book, but the book apparently had interpretations I wasn't privy to understanding. Carlos, the former Coast Guard pilot, became my closest colleague and the only person I could discuss these observations with honestly. During overnight stays in small hotels, we'd compare experiences and try to determine whether the extra scrutiny we received was intentional or simply the result of being more visible in a workplace where we were clearly minorities. Maybe we're being paranoid, Carlos would say, but neither of us really believed that. The first formal complaint against my performance came after a passenger wrote to the airline expressing concern about my professionalism and competence following a perfectly routine flight from Cincinnati to Charleston. The passenger had apparently decided that my pre-flight inspection was too hasty and that I looked too young and inexperienced to be responsible for aircraft safety. The letter was filed in my personnel record despite Captain Williams's written statement that my performance had been flawless. 2 more passenger complaints followed over the next 3 months, both citing concerns about my qualifications that seemed disconnected from any actual problems with flight operations. The pattern was becoming clear. Some passengers simply weren't comfortable seeing someone who looked like me in a pilot's uniform, and the airline's customer service policy required treating all complaints seriously, regardless of their validity. Each letter was accompanied by a conversation with management about maintaining high standards and customer confidence. By my first anniversary at Skybridge, I'd accumulated over 800 flight hours without a single safety incident or operational violation, but my personnel file contained more passenger complaints than pilots with twice my experience. During my annual review, the chief pilot praised my technical skills while suggesting I work on customer relations and projecting authority. When I asked for specific guidance on what that meant, he couldn't provide concrete examples, just a vague recommendation to consider how passengers perceive confidence. The promotion cycle that year passed me over for upgrade to captain despite my seniority and performance record. 3 pilots with less experience advanced, including one who'd been hired 2 months after me but had somehow accumulated fewer passenger complaints. When I inquired about the criteria for advancement, I was told that command presence was a crucial factor that went beyond technical competence, though exactly how that was measured remained unclear. That night, lying in my shared apartment, listening to my roommate snore while calculating how many more years I'd need at this salary to pay off my loans, I began seriously questioning whether the dream was worth the reality. Every day brought new reminders that I was being evaluated by standards that seemed designed to keep me from advancing, regardless of how well I actually performed my job. The love of flying remained, but the joy was being systematically worn away by an industry that appeared determined to treat me as a permanent outsider. The transfer opportunity to Great Lakes Airways came 18 months later, after I'd accumulated enough flight hours and experience to qualify for positions at larger regional carriers. The salary increase was modest, $28,000 instead of $22,000, but the aircraft were newer and the routes covered a broader territory throughout the upper Midwest. More importantly, it meant escaping the accumulated passenger complaints and personnel file issues that had followed me at Skybridge, though I was careful not to express that relief during my interview. Captain Jackson was the first person in my aviation career who looked like me and had actually made it to a position of authority. At 52, he'd spent 15 years flying for Great Lakes after military service and a decade at smaller regional carriers. During my first trip as his first officer, he was direct in a way that both surprised and relieved me. "You're going to face things here that white pilots don't deal with," he said during our pre-flight briefing. "The question is whether you let it derail you or use it as motivation to be better than they expect." It was the first acknowledgement from another pilot that the challenges I'd experienced weren't imaginary or the result of my own shortcomings. Captain Jackson shared stories from his own career. The passenger who'd demanded a different pilot upon seeing him in uniform. The chief pilot who'd told him he didn't fit the company image. The countless times he'd been mistaken for ground crew or maintenance staff while walking through airports in full pilot regalia. His advice was practical rather than inspirational. Document everything, exceed every standard, and never give them a legitimate reason to question your competence. The flying itself was more complex and demanding than my previous position. Great Lakes operated Embraer regional jets on routes connecting smaller cities to major hubs, requiring more sophisticated navigation and weather management skills. The passenger loads were higher, the schedules tighter, and the expectations for on-time performance more stringent. I found myself energized by the increased responsibility and complexity, even as it required longer study sessions and more preparation time between trips. My new captain partners were generally professional, though I could sense the familiar pattern of initial skepticism followed by grudging acceptance as they observed my actual performance. Captain Martinez was efficient and focused on getting the job done without unnecessary conversation, Captain Brooks asked detailed questions about my training and experience during our first flight together, but settled into a comfortable working relationship once he was satisfied with my competence. Neither treated me as an equal exactly, but both treated me fairly. The passenger dynamics remained challenging in predictable ways. Business travelers on morning flights were often too focused on their phones to pay attention to the cockpit crew, but leisure travelers and older passengers frequently expressed surprise or concern upon seeing me in pilot uniform. The flight attendants had developed diplomatic responses to questions about pilot qualifications, and most handled these situations professionally without making me feel responsible for passenger ignorance. After 8 months at Great Lakes, I received an email from Captain Jackson asking if I'd be interested in participating in a mentorship program for minority aviation students at a local community college. The time commitment was modest, one Saturday morning per month, but the opportunity to share my experience with students facing similar challenges appealed to me. During my first visit, I met 12 students ranging in age from 18 to 35, all working toward aviation careers while navigating financial and social obstacles I recognized from my own journey. The questions they asked during that first session revealed how isolated many of them felt in their programs, and how few examples they had of people who looked like them succeeding in aviation careers. When one student asked if the industry had gotten better about diversity and inclusion, I found myself giving an honest answer that acknowledged both progress and persistent challenges. There are more opportunities now than when I started, I told them, but you'll still need to work harder and be better prepared than some of your classmates. The mentorship program connected me with other minority pilots in the region, including several who flew for major airline. During informal gatherings, I learned about application strategies, interview preparation, and the unspoken requirements for advancement that weren't covered in any training manual. Captain Davis, who flew Boeing 737s for Southwest, emphasized the importance of building relationships and finding advocates within whatever organization I eventually joined. Technical competence gets you in the door, he explained, but advancement requires people who will vouch for your character and potential. These conversations helped me understand that my experience at Skybridge hadn't been unique or the result of particularly bad luck. Every minority pilot I met had similar stories of passenger complaints, extra scrutiny from management, and the exhausting requirement to constantly prove their competence. The difference was that some had found ways to navigate these challenges more effectively, building careers despite the additional obstacles rather than being derailed by them. My application to major airlines began during my second year at Great Lakes, when I'd accumulated the 1,500 flight hours required for airline transport pilot certification. The process was more complex than I'd expected, requiring not just technical qualifications but also psychological evaluation, background checks, and multiple rounds of interviews. The preparation consumed most of my free time, studying everything from aircraft systems to company histories to industry trends. The first interview invitation came from United Airlines, followed 2 weeks later by Delta and American. Each required travel to training centers for multi-day evaluation processes that tested everything from technical knowledge to decision-making under pressure to interpersonal skills with simulated crew members. The costs of these trips strained my already tight budget, but Captain Jackson advised me to view them as investments in my future rather than expenses I couldn't afford. The United interview process was the most comprehensive I'd ever experienced. 3 days of written exams, simulator evaluations, group exercises, and individual interviews with pilots, human resources representatives, and psychologists. I felt confident about my technical performance, but uncertain about how my personality and communication style had been perceived by evaluators who might have different expectations for someone who looked like me. The call came 6 weeks later while I was preparing for a trip pairing with Captain Brooks. "Congratulations," the hiring manager said. "We'd like to offer you a position in our next new hire class starting in 8 weeks. The salary would nearly double my current income. The benefits were comprehensive, and most importantly, it represented entry into the major airline career I'd been working toward for over a decade." As I hung up the phone, I realized I was shaking a combination of relief, excitement, and the knowledge that the real challenges were just beginning. That evening, I called my parents from my hotel room in Des Moines to share the news. Mom cried, Dad cleared his throat several times before speaking, and both expressed pride that felt different encouragement. "You did it, son," Dad said. "All those years of working twice as hard finally paid off." I didn't have the heart to tell them that reaching this milestone probably meant more years of working twice as hard, just at a higher level, with bigger stakes. The United Airlines training facility in Denver sprawled across several buildings filled with flight simulators, classrooms, and administrative offices that processed hundreds of new hire pilots every month. My class of 32 pilots included former military aviators, regional airline veterans like myself, and a few corporate pilots transitioning to commercial aviation. I was one of 2 black pilots in the group, along with 3 women and a mix of backgrounds that represented more diversity than I'd seen in any previous training environment. The initial paperwork and orientation sessions felt familiar from my regional airline experience, but the scale and complexity of United's operation became apparent during facility tours and introductory briefings. We'd be training on Boeing 737s initially, with the possibility of transitioning to other aircraft types based on company needs and seniority progression. The training timeline was aggressive. 6 weeks of ground school followed by simulator training and final evaluations that would determine whether we'd earn positions as first officers. My assigned study group included Mike, a former Air Force pilot who'd flown C-130S, Jennifer, who'd worked her way up through regional airlines similar to my own path, and Brad, whose father had been a United captain and who'd grown up around aviation. The dynamics felt different from my community college experience, more professional and focused on shared goals rather than social hierarchies, but I still found myself being more careful about speaking up during discussions until I was certain my contributions would be valued. The ground school curriculum covered everything from United's specific operating procedures to Boeing 737 systems to federal regulations that applied to major airline operations. The pace was relentless, with 8-hour classroom days followed by mandatory study time that often stretched past midnight. Our instructors were experienced United pilots who approached teaching with the same precision they brought to flight operations, emphasizing that the standards we'd be held to were significantly higher than anything we'd experienced at regional carriers. Captain Thompson, our primary instructor, had the distinction of being the only black training captain at the facility. He was professional and demanding with all students, but I noticed he paid particular attention to my performance and preparation, often asking follow-up questions that pushed me to demonstrate deeper understanding than what might satisfy basic requirements. After the first week, he asked me to stay after class for a brief conversation that I approached with the usual mix of anxiety and curiosity. "You're doing fine," he said, reviewing my test scores and participation notes. "But fine isn't going to be enough. You need to be exceptional, not because that's fair, but because that's reality." He went on to explain that major airline training was designed to identify weaknesses and eliminate candidates who couldn't meet the highest standards, but that the definition of those standards sometimes varied depending on who was being evaluated. "Study harder than you think you need to," he advised. "Prepare for questions they don't ask other people." The simulator training began in week 4, with sessions that tested our ability to handle normal operations, emergency procedures, and the kind of complex decision-making scenarios that separated competent pilots from those capable of managing major airline operations. My first session was with Captain Rogers, a 20-year United veteran who observed my performance with the same intensity I'd grown accustomed to receiving from evaluators throughout my career. When I completed the required maneuvers successfully, he nodded approvingly, but didn't offer the encouraging comments I heard him give to some other students. The psychological evaluation component surprised me with its thoroughness and focus on personality traits that weren't directly related to flying skills. Questions about leadership style, conflict resolution, and decision-making under pressure seemed designed to assess whether candidates would fit into United's culture rather than simply whether they could operate aircraft safely. I answered honestly while trying to project the kind of confidence and authority that airlines apparently valued, though exactly what they were looking for remained somewhat mysterious. My study group developed into a genuine support system as the pressure intensified during the final weeks of training. Mike's military background provided insights into crew resource management that helped all of us improve our communication skills. Jennifer's experience with challenging weather operations filled gaps in my own knowledge. Brad's familiarity with United's culture and expectations offered practical advice about company politics and advancement opportunities that wasn't covered in any official curriculum. The final evaluation period consisted of comprehensive written exams, simulator check rides, and individual interviews with training staff who would determine our suitability for line operations. The check ride was conducted by Captain Williams, an examiner known for thorough evaluation and high standards. He tested me on scenarios that went beyond the required curriculum, asking me to demonstrate decision-making skills in situations that seemed designed to find the limits of my knowledge and composure. When the evaluation concluded and Captain Williams completed his paperwork, he was quiet for several minutes before delivering his assessment. "You passed," he said, signing my training completion certificate, "and you handled some scenarios better than pilots with more experience." It was the most positive feedback I'd received from an evaluator in years, though he followed it with advice about maintaining high standards and continuing to develop my skills during line operations. The graduation ceremony was modest but meaningful, with 31 of our original 32 candidates receiving first officer assignments. The one failure had been academic rather than flight-related, a reminder that making it this far still required meeting every requirement without exception. As we received our employee identification cards and initial schedule assignments, I felt a sense of accomplishment tempered by awareness that training had been the easier part of this transition. My first line assignment paired me with Captain Martinez for a 4-day trip sequence covering routes between Denver, Phoenix, and smaller western cities. He was professional and thorough during our pre-flight briefing, explaining his expectations and communication preferences without the subtle condescension I'd grown accustomed to receiving from some captains. When passengers boarded, and I made the standard first officer announcements, I noticed fewer surprised looks and questioning murmurs than I'd experienced at regional airlines. The flying itself was smoother and more sophisticated in my previous experience, with better equipment, more comprehensive weather information, and air traffic control systems designed to handle the higher volume and complexity of major airline operation. The Boeing 737 responded predictably and performed exactly as trained, making it easier to focus on operational efficiency and passenger service rather than aircraft management. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was using my skills at an appropriate level rather than being held back by equipment limitations or organizational constraints. After completing my first month of line operations, Captain Thompson asked me to join him for coffee during a layover in Phoenix. "How's it going?" he asked, and I gave him an honest assessment of the adjustment challenges and the satisfaction of finally working for a major airline. He listened carefully before sharing his own experience transitioning to United 15 years earlier, including obstacles and opportunities I should anticipate as I built seniority and experience. "The work gets easier," he said, "but the politics don't. Stay focused on what you can control." That night, calling my parents from my hotel room to update them on my progress, I realized that reaching this level felt like both an ending and a beginning. The goal I'd worked toward for 15 years had been achieved, but Captain Thompson's warning about politics suggested that advancement would require navigating challenges beyond technical competence. I was finally flying for a major airline, earning a living wage and building toward the captain upgrade that represented real authority and responsibility. But I was also learning that success at this level brought new forms of scrutiny and expectation that would test skills I was still developing. The captain upgrade opportunity came after 6 years at United, when I'd accumulated enough seniority and flight hours to bid for left seat positions on the Boeing 737. The training process was more intense than my initial hire experience, requiring mastery of command decision-making, crew leadership, and the ultimate responsibility for aircraft operations that couldn't be shared with anyone else. When I pinned on captain's bars for the first time, looking at myself in the bathroom mirror before my first trip as pilot in command, I thought about the 8-year-old boy watching planes at that county air show and wondered what he would think of this moment. The weight of the position became apparent immediately during my first revenue flight as captain. Every decision, from taxi routes to weather interpretations to passenger announcements, was mine to make and mine to defend if questioned later. My first officer, a former Air Force pilot named Kevin with more total flight experience than me, was professional and competent, but I could sense his initial skepticism about taking direction from someone who looked like me and appeared younger than my 35 years. That skepticism extended to passengers, flight attendants, and ground personnel who seemed surprised to see someone of my appearance in the captain's seat. During pre-flight walkarounds, gate agents occasionally asked if I was the captain or the first officer, and passengers boarding sometimes paused at the cockpit door with expressions of uncertainty they tried to hide. The questions weren't direct anymore. Professional courtesy prevented that, but the doubt was visible in hesitant nods and sideways glances. Flight attendants presented a different challenge, as their professional relationships with captains involved complex dynamics of authority, safety responsibility, and crew coordination that required mutual respect to function effectively. Some adapted quickly to my command style and treated me with the same deference they showed other captains. Others seemed to require constant reassurance about decisions that would have been accepted without question from different commanders, asking for explanations of routine operational choices that suggested underlying uncertainty about my competence. The technical aspects of command came naturally after years of preparation and observation, but the psychological pressure of representation was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every mistake, no matter how minor, felt amplified because I knew it would be remembered differently than similar errors from other captains. Every decision that delayed a flight or required coordination with maintenance or air traffic control became an opportunity for observers to question whether I possessed the judgment and authority necessary for command responsibility. 3 months into my captain tenure, I received my first formal passenger complaint since joining United. A business traveler had written to express concern about my unprofessional demeanor during a routine flight from Denver to Dallas, citing my casual attitude and lack of command presence despite the flight completing on schedule with no operational issues. When the chief pilot called me in to discuss the complaint, he was diplomatic but direct about the importance of maintaining passenger confidence through appropriate command bearing. The irony wasn't lost on me that developing appropriate command bearing required projecting authority while avoiding any appearance of arrogance or aggression that might trigger different types of complaints. The balance was delicate and seemed to require constant adjustment based on crew composition, passenger demographics, and operational circumstances that weren't covered in any training manual. I found myself studying other captains' communication styles and adapting techniques that worked for them to my own command approach. Captain Thompson, who had become an informal mentor, offered practical advice during one of our occasional conversations. "You're going to be held to different standards," he said matter-of-factly. "Some passengers will never be comfortable seeing you in command, and some crew members will test your authority in ways they wouldn't with other captains. The key is being so competent and professional that reasonable people can't question your qualifications and letting unreasonable people reveal themselves through their own behavior." My safety record remained perfect through my first year as captain, with on-time performance and passenger service metrics that exceeded company averages. The Flight Operations Department recognized my performance with inclusion in their leadership development program, which provided additional training in crew resource management and advanced decision-making scenarios. The recognition felt validating, but it also came with increased visibility and expectations that added pressure to maintain exceptional standards. The mentorship program I'd joined years earlier took on new significance once I achieved captain status, as students and junior pilots now had an example of someone who looked like them reaching command authority at a major airline. During monthly sessions, I shared practical advice about career progression while trying to be honest about the additional challenges they should expect without discouraging their ambition. Their questions about handling discrimination and building resilience reminded me of my own uncertainty during early career stages. Year 2 as captain brought route assignments to international destinations, adding complexity and responsibility that required additional training and certification. Flying to European and South American cities meant longer trips, more complex crew coordination, and passenger service standards that reflected United's global reputation. The international flying also meant more exposure to diverse crew members and passengers, some of whom seemed more accepting of pilot diversity than domestic travelers. During a layover in Frankfurt, I was walking through the airport in uniform when another United captain approached me with a friendly greeting. Captain Davis was a 20-year veteran who'd apparently heard about my performance through company channels. "You're building a good reputation," he told me over coffee in the crew lounge. "Word gets around about captains who handle their business professionally. Keep doing what you're doing and doors will open for you down the line." That conversation was the first indication that my efforts to exceed standards and maintain professionalism despite extra scrutiny were being noticed by senior pilots whose opinions influenced advancement opportunities. The airline industry, like many professional fields, operated through informal networks and reputation-based recommendations that could accelerate or limit career progression. Being accepted into those networks required not just competence, but also the kind of character assessment that came from observing how someone handled pressure and responsibility over time. The vacation flight that would lead to that defining moment at the beginning of my story was a personal trip to visit college friends in Colorado, taken during a rare stretch of several days off between trip assignments. I was traveling in civilian clothes, jeans, polo shirt, and sneakers, looking like any other passenger rather than the United captain I'd worked 15 years to become. The anonymity felt comfortable after months of constant evaluation and scrutiny that came with wearing the uniform. Walking through the airport toward my gate, carrying a small travel bag and wearing clothes that revealed nothing about my profession, I was just another traveler in the crowd. No one looked twice. No one questioned my presence. No one made assumptions about my qualifications or capabilities. For a few hours, I could simply be Marcus heading to see friends, rather than Captain Marcus representing his airline, his profession, and everyone who looked like him in aviation. It was the first time in months I'd felt truly relaxed in an airport environment. The irony of what was about to happen, being mistaken for maintenance crew while traveling as a passenger on my own airline, would only become clear in retrospect. At that moment, boarding my flight in civilian clothes, I had no idea that the next few minutes would crystallize everything I'd experienced during 15 years of proving myself in an industry that seemed determined to see me as an outsider, regardless of my qualifications or performance. The flight attendant who tapped my shoulder was young, probably in her first year with the airline, with the kind of nervous efficiency that comes from trying to manage too many responsibilities while learning company procedures. I was settling into my first-class seat, 2A, when she approached with a polite but firm expression that suggested she was about to correct what she perceived as a mistake. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly, leaning down so other passengers couldn't hear. "Maintenance is down that," pointing toward the jet bridge entrance. For a moment, I didn't understand what she was telling me. I looked down at myself. Jeans, polo shirt, sneakers. Nothing that would indicate I worked for the airline. Then back at her expectant face. The realization hit me slowly. The same sick feeling I'd experienced countless times over the past 15 years. Whenever someone made assumptions about my role or capabilities based on my appearance. She had seen a black man in the first-class cabin and concluded I must be there by mistake. Probably a maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft. I could have responded with anger or indignation, could have immediately corrected her assumption with the sharp edge that years of similar incidents had taught me to deploy when necessary. Instead, I found myself curious about how this would play out, whether she would realize her error on her own, or if intervention would be required. "I'm actually a passenger," I said, showing her my boarding pass. "Seat 2A. She glanced at the pass, then back at me, her expression shifting from certainty to confusion as she processed information that didn't match her initial assessment. "Oh," she said, her face beginning to redden as the implications of her mistake became apparent. "I'm sorry. You're not in uniform, so I assumed." She trailed off, realizing that explaining her assumption would only make the situation worse. I smiled and settled back into my seat, watching her retreat toward the galley while trying to figure out how to recover from what was clearly a mortifying error in judgment. The other passengers in first class had observed this interaction with the kind of careful attention that people pay to uncomfortable situations they want to understand but don't want to become involved in. An older businessman across the aisle gave me a sympathetic nod, while a woman 2 rows up turned around briefly with an expression that suggested she recognized the discrimination that had just occurred. The awkwardness hung in the air as boarding continued, and the flight attendant avoided eye contact while completing her pre-flight duties. 20 minutes later, as we prepared for departure, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit to speak with the lead flight attendant about something routine, probably a minor maintenance issue or updated arrival information. He was a senior captain I'd flown with several times during my years at United, a consummate professional who commanded respect throughout the pilot group. When he spotted me in seat 2A, his face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Marcus," he called out, walking over to my seat with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he was genuinely happy to see me. "I didn't know you were on this flight. How's your vacation going?" The entire first-class cabin turned to observe this interaction, including the flight attendant who had directed me toward maintenance 30 minutes earlier. Her expression shifted from confusion to what appeared to be dawning horror as she began to understand who I actually was. "Going well, thanks," I replied, standing to shake his hand. "Just heading to Denver to see some friends. How's the new 787 treating you?" We chatted briefly about his recent transition to the wide-body aircraft, the kind of shop talk that pilots share when they encounter colleagues in unexpected settings. The conversation was relaxed and collegial, the interaction between 2 professionals who respected each other's experience and competence. As Captain Rodriguez prepared to return to the cockpit, he paused and looked at me with the slight formality that acknowledged my rank within the company hierarchy. "Have a great trip, Captain," he said, emphasizing my title in a way that was clearly intended for the benefit of anyone within hearing distance. Then, he snapped a crisp salute, the kind of gesture that pilots sometimes used to acknowledge exceptional performance or significant achievements, before disappearing back into the cockpit. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the ambient noise of the aircraft's environmental systems and the distant sounds of ground crew completing final preparations for departure. Every passenger in first class now understood exactly what had transpired. A flight attendant had assumed that a black man didn't belong in their section and had tried to redirect him to where she thought he should be, only to discover that he was actually a captain with the airline, outranking everyone on the aircraft except the pilots in command. The flight attendant approached my seat again, this time with an expression of genuine mortification and what appeared to be carefully rehearsed words. "Captain," she said quietly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I made an inappropriate assumption, and I'm deeply sorry for any offense I caused. It won't happen again." Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she spoke, clearly understanding that this incident could have serious implications for her career if I chose to file a complaint. "Apology accepted," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but not harsh. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." I could have pursued the matter further, could have used this as a teaching moment about the assumptions people make and the impact of unconscious bias. Instead, I chose to demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that I'd learned was often more effective than confrontation in changing hearts and minds. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident, though I noticed the flight attendant was particularly attentive to all passengers and seemed to be making an effort to treat everyone with exceptional courtesy. During the beverage service, she thanked me again for my understanding and mentioned that she would be discussing the incident with her supervisor to ensure it didn't happen to anyone. Her willingness to acknowledge the mistake and take responsibility suggested that this might actually become a positive learning experience rather than just an embarrassing moment she wanted to forget. After landing in Denver, as passengers deplaned and I gathered my belongings, several people approached me with comments that ranged from supportive to apologetic. The businessman across the aisle shook my hand and thanked me for handling the situation with such dignity. An elderly woman mentioned that she had a grandson interested in aviation and asked if I had any advice for young people pursuing pilot careers. Their responses suggested that witnessing the incident had given them insight into challenges they might not have previously considered. Walking through Denver International Airport toward baggage claim, I reflected on how that brief interaction had encapsulated everything I'd experienced during my 15-year journey to the captain's seat. The initial assumption that I didn't belong, the need to prove my qualifications through the validation of others, the choice between confrontation and education, and ultimately, the recognition that changing perceptions required patience and professionalism rather than anger and indignation. That evening, having dinner with college friends who had known me since before I'd ever set foot in an aircraft, I shared the story as an example of how far I'd come and how much further the industry still needed to go. Their outrage on my behalf was gratifying, but I found myself more focused on the flight attendant's willingness to apologize and learn than on the initial slight itself. After 15 years of similar incidents, I'd learned that progress often came through individual moments of recognition rather than systemic change. The next morning, I received an email from United's chief pilot asking if I had a few minutes to discuss an incident report that had been filed regarding yesterday's flight. The flight attendant had voluntarily reported her mistake and requested additional training on unconscious bias and customer service. Her proactive response impressed me and suggested that the airline was taking these issues seriously, not just responding to complaints, but working to prevent future occurrences. 6 months later, I was asked to participate in United's diversity and inclusion training program, sharing my experiences with new hire classes and helping to develop protocols for addressing bias incidents when they occurred. The role felt like a natural extension of the mentorship work I'd been doing for years, but with the added authority that came from my captain's position and the recognition that my perspective had value beyond just technical aviation knowledge. Today, as I prepare for flights and walk through airports in uniform, I still encounter occasional assumptions and questioning looks, but they feel different now. The confidence that comes from achieving undeniable success, combined with the knowledge that I've helped create opportunities for others who will follow, has changed how I respond to these situations. I no longer feel the need to prove myself to every skeptical observer because I've already proven myself to the people and institutions that matter. The young pilots I mentor now include people from backgrounds even more diverse than mine, and their questions remind me that the barriers I've faced were just one generation's version of challenges that continue to evolve. My advice to them is the same guidance I wish I'd received 20 years ago. Focus on becoming so competent that reasonable people can't question your qualifications. Find mentors who will advocate for your advancement. And remember that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply succeeding despite it. Looking back on that moment in the aircraft cabin, watching a flight attendant realize that her assumptions had led her to mistake a captain for maintenance crew, I'm struck by how perfectly it illustrated the journey I'd taken from that 8-year-old boy at the county air show to the position I hold today. The path was longer and more difficult than it should have been, but it led to exactly where I always knew I belonged, in the left seat of a commercial airliner, responsible for the safety and service that passengers trust us to provide every day. The dream that began with watching planes dance across a summer sky had survived 15 years of doubt, discrimination, and the exhausting requirement to constantly prove my worth. That flight attendant's salute from Captain Rodriguez wasn't just recognition of my rank within the company. It was acknowledgement that I had earned my place in an industry that hadn't always been willing to make room for people who looked like me, and that my presence there was making it easier for others to follow.